The snow was coming down harder than they predicted. My wipers were really struggling as I pulled into my parents' driveway, and I could barely see a thing. Grandpa John was in the passenger seat, his wheelchair tucked neatly in the trunk. He'd been with me for a couple of years now, ever since his stroke made walking a challenge. And honestly, despite what my dad, David, always said about it being too much for me, we'd figured it out. Another Johnson family Christmas, Grandpa John mumbled, that dry humor I'd grown to love even more since he moved in with me. Can't wait to hear what your father complains about this year. I managed a weak smile, turning off the engine. Dad, David Johnson, had become increasingly difficult over the past decade. What started as general grumpiness in his 50s had evolved into full-blown bitterness now that he was 68. My mom, Sarah, had learned to simply nod along with whatever he said, her spirit worn down by 43 years of marriage to a man who saw criticism as a love language. The real tension, though, centered around Grandpa John. Dad resented having to help with his own father's care, even though I'd taken on literally all of it. Dad saw Grandpa's stroke as an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. He'd suggested nursing homes at least 15 times in the past 2 years. Each recommendation met with my firm refusal, and Grandpa's even firmer middle finger. "Let's just get through dinner," I said, climbing out to retrieve the wheelchair. "We'll eat, exchange gifts, and be home by 9. Famous last words, Grandpa sighed. My brother Kevin's car was already parked in front of the house, which meant his wife Rachel would be inside along with their twin boys, Caleb and Ethan, who were probably already tearing through Mom's carefully arranged decorations. Kevin had always been Dad's favorite, mainly because he never questioned anything and had followed in Dad's footsteps by becoming an insurance adjuster. I committed the cardinal sin of becoming a high school art teacher, a career Dad viewed as barely employed. Getting Grandpa up the front steps took some maneuvering. The house wasn't wheelchair accessible, which Dad refused to remedy despite my repeated offers to pay for a ramp installation. We managed with me supporting most of Grandpa's weight while he used the stair railing, then settling him back into the wheelchair once we reached the porch. Mom opened the door before I could knock, her face already tight with stress. "Oh, good. You're here. Your father's in a mood. When isn't he?" Grandpa wheezed, and Mom shot him a look that was half warning, half agreement. The house smelled like turkey and tension. Rachel stood in the kitchen wearing an apron that said, "Blessed and stressed," which felt appropriate for the evening ahead. The twins, Caleb and Ethan, were 7 years old and currently engaged in what appeared to be a lightsaber battle using Mom's wooden spoons. "Boys, put those down," Rachel called out without much conviction. They ignored her completely. Kevin emerged from the living room with a beer already in hand, despite it being only 5 in the afternoon. "Hey, sis, Dad's watching the game." Code 4. That meant Dad was already irritated and looking for reasons to explode. I wheeled Grandpa into the living room where Dad sat in his recliner like a king on a throne, eyes fixed on the television showing some football game he probably didn't care about. He barely glanced our way. "You're late," he grunted. "We're 10 minutes early, Dad," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Dinner's not until 6. Traffic was probably bad with her driving," he said to the television rather than to me. "Women and snow don't mix." Grandpa's jaw tightened, but he stayed quiet. We developed a strategy over the years: don't engage with Dad's baiting comments. It only made things worse. I parked Grandpa's wheelchair near the fireplace where he could stay warm and went to help Mom and Rachel in the kitchen. Mom was basting the turkey with movements that were just a bit too aggressive, taking out her frustration on poultry. "How bad is he today?" I asked quietly. "He got a letter from John's doctor about some follow-up appointments," Mom said, not meeting my eyes. "He's angry about the medical bills." "I pay all of Grandpa's medical bills," I said, feeling my own anger rising. "Every single one. Dad hasn't contributed a dime." "You know how he gets about money," Rachel interjected, clearly trying to play peacemaker. "He thinks everything affects him somehow." What she meant was that Dad was furious I was spending my money on Grandpa's care instead of, what? Giving it to him? Dad made decent money from his 40 years in insurance before retiring. He wasn't hurting financially. He was just hurting emotionally and wanted everyone else to hurt, too. Dinner was served at 6 sharp because Dad insisted on punctuality while being perpetually late himself. Getting Grandpa positioned at the table required moving chairs around, which Dad watched with theatrical sighs like we were performing experimental theater rather than accommodating a wheelchair. The meal started civilly enough. Mom had outdone herself with the food, the turkey perfectly golden and moist. For about 15 minutes, we existed in that fragile peace that comes from people focusing on eating rather than talking. Then Kevin's son Caleb knocked over his milk, and the evening's trajectory shifted. Good grief! Dad snapped, slamming his fork down. Can't you control your kids, Kevin? He's 7, Dad. Accidents happen, Kevin said, though his tone held an apology. When I was 7, I knew how to sit at a table without destroying everything, Dad continued, warming up now. But nobody disciplines kids anymore. Everyone's too worried about hurting their precious feelings. Rachel got up to clean the spill, her face flushed with embarrassment. Mom offered to help, but Dad waved her back down. Let her handle her own kid's mess. Sarah, you baby everyone too much. The room fell into uncomfortable silence, except for the sound of paper towels absorbing milk. I kept my eyes on my plate, willing the meal to end quickly. But Dad wasn't finished. His eyes landed on Grandpa, who was eating slowly, his hands still affected by the stroke's lasting impacts. Sometimes food fell from his fork, a source of shame for Grandpa and ammunition for Dad. You're making a mess over there, Pop, Dad said, his voice dripping with disgust. I'm managing fine, Grandpa replied quietly. You're dropping food all over Mom's tablecloth. This is ridiculous. David, leave him alone, Mom said, her voice barely above a whisper. I will not leave him alone. This is my house, and I'm tired of watching him eat like a toddler. Bad enough he gestured at me, drags him everywhere like some kind of charity case. He's your father, I said, my own voice shaking with suppressed rage. And he's not a charity case. He's a human being who had a stroke. A stroke 2 years ago. Dad shot back. How long are we supposed to pretend this is normal? He should be in a facility where professionals can handle him. He's living with me, and we're doing just fine. Oh, you're doing fine. Dad's voice rose. You're 34 years old, unmarried, living in a cramped apartment, playing babysitter to an old man who should have the dignity to accept his limitations. That's enough, Grandpa said, his voice stronger now. Don't talk to her that way. I'll talk to her however I want. This is my house. It's Christmas dinner. Mom pleaded. Can we please just, no, Sarah? We cannot just anything. I'm sick of this. I'm sick of him showing up here, making everyone uncomfortable, needing special accommodations. I'm sick of her acting like some kind of saint for taking care of him when she should be building her own life. Each word hit like a physical blow. Kevin kept his eyes on his plate. The coward. Rachel had gone pale, her hands gripping her napkin. The twins had gone unnaturally quiet, sensing the adult tension. If you have something to say to me, Dad, then say it directly, I challenged him, my heart pounding. Stop dancing around whatever is really bothering you. He stood up so abruptly, his chair scraped loudly against the floor. You want direct? Fine. I'm tired of you bringing him here. I'm tired of pretending we're all one big happy family when you clearly think you're better than the rest of us with your noble caretaker act. And I'm especially tired of looking at him sitting there, a shell of what he used to be, reminding me of what's waiting for all of us. The truth of it hung in the air like smoke. This wasn't about Grandpa's needs or my choices. This was about Dad's fear of his own mortality, his terror of becoming dependent, his rage at the universe for making him vulnerable. So that's what this is, Grandpa said softly. You're angry because you're scared. I'm not scared of anything, old man. You're scared of ending up like me, and you're taking it out on everyone else because you can't face your own fear. Dad's face turned a dangerous shade of red. Get out! The words hung there for a moment, nobody quite believing he'd said them. What? I asked. You heard me. Get out! Both of you. I don't want you in my house. David, it's Christmas. Mom said, tears now streaming down her face. Please don't do this. They can leave or I'll call the police and have them removed for trespassing. Their choice. Dad, come on, Kevin finally found his voice. This is insane. Then you can leave too if you don't like it. Kevin immediately fell silent, proving exactly where his loyalties lay. I stood up slowly, my whole body shaking. Fine, we'll go. Good riddance. Getting Grandpa back into his wheelchair and out of that house took every ounce of control I had. Mom cried quietly in the corner, but she didn't follow us out. She never did. Kevin helped carry the wheelchair down the steps, his one act of minimal decency, before retreating back inside without a word. The snow had intensified while we were inside. The temperature had dropped to what felt like single digits, and the wind cut through my coat like it wasn't even there. I got Grandpa into the passenger seat and cranked the heat as high as it would go, but my car needed time to warm up. I'm sorry, Grandpa said, his voice cracking. This is my fault. None of this is your fault, I told him fiercely, wiping away tears I hadn't realized I was crying. Dad's been a miserable person for years. Tonight, he just showed everyone exactly who he is. Still, you shouldn't have to deal with this because of me. I'm not dealing with anything because of you. I'm dealing with it because I have a father who's incapable of basic human decency. We sat in the driveway for a few minutes, waiting for the car to warm up enough to drive safely. Through the front window, I could see shadows moving around inside, life continuing as though they hadn't just thrown us out into a snowstorm on Christmas. Can I tell you something? Grandpa asked as I finally shifted into reverse. Of course. I'm proud of you. Your father doesn't see it. Maybe he never will, but you're twice the person he'll ever be. I had to pull over a block away because I was crying too hard to see the road. We sat there in my idling car, snow piling up around us, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. The rejection, the cruelty, the absolute devastation of being cast out by my own father on Christmas. We should go somewhere, Grandpa said after a while. Not home yet. Somewhere? Somewhere better than this. Like where? Everything's closed for Christmas. He was quiet for a long moment, then said something that changed everything. I know a place. Drive to 1247 Riverside Drive. What's at Riverside Drive? Just trust me, please. The address he gave me led to one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city. The houses here weren't houses, they were estates. Mansions with gated driveways and perfectly manicured lawns that probably had their own landscaping teams. I drove slowly, checking the numbers, convinced Grandpa had made a mistake or was confused. This can't be right, I said. Keep going. The one with the iron gates and the fountain out front. I pulled up to exactly that property and stopped, staring. The house beyond the gates looked like something from a magazine. 3 stories of classic architecture with lights glowing warmly in multiple windows. The fountain, currently turned off for winter, was carved marble. Grandpa, whose house is this? He pulled something from his wallet, a key fob. He pressed a button, and the gate swung open smoothly. Mine. I sat there with my mouth open while he directed me up the circular driveway to the front entrance. The property was massive. From what I could see, there were additional buildings on the grounds, a guest house maybe, or a pool house. The garage alone looked bigger than my entire apartment. What's happening right now? I asked, my voice faint. Help me inside and I'll explain everything. The front door opened with another key from his wallet. I helped him from the car to his wheelchair, both of us covered in snow by now, and pushed him through the entrance into a foyer that belonged in a museum, marble floors, a crystal chandelier, a staircase that curved up to a second-floor landing. Grandpa flipped a switch, and lights came on throughout the first floor. The house was furnished, not with dust-covered antiques, but with comfortable, clearly used furniture. Someone had been living here. Someone was still living here. Sit down, Grandpa said, gesturing to a living room that could fit my entire apartment inside it. You're going to want to sit down. I sank onto a leather sofa that probably cost more than my car. Grandpa positioned his wheelchair across from me and took a deep breath. Your father thinks I'm poor, he began. He thinks the stroke wiped out my savings. He thinks I'm dependent on you for everything, barely scraping by on Social Security. Aren't you? Grandpa smiled, and it was the smile of a man with a secret he'd been keeping for a very long time. My full name is John Arthur Peterson. 53 years ago, I started a small import business with a friend from college. We bought goods from overseas manufacturers and sold them to American retailers. Nothing fancy, just basic consumer goods, kitchen supplies, tools, that sort of thing. I nodded, not understanding where this was going. The business did well. Really well. We expanded, hired staff, opened warehouses across the country. When the internet boom hit in the 90s, we were positioned perfectly. We became one of the major suppliers for the big box stores and then for online retailers. We went public in 1998. Okay, I said slowly. In 2004, we sold the company to a private equity firm for just over $1.8 billion. My share, after taxes and splitting with my partner, was roughly $900 million. The number was so large it didn't feel real. $900 million, I invested carefully. Real estate mostly, commercial properties, apartment buildings, some residential development. Over the past 20 years, the portfolio has grown substantially. My current net worth, as of my accountant's last quarterly report, is approximately $2.3 billion. I couldn't breathe. $2.3 billion, give or take. The market fluctuates. But you are living in that tiny house. You were living on Social Security. When you had the stroke, you didn't have private nurses or, I wanted to see you really cared, Grandpa interrupted gently. Not about my money, about me. Your father made it clear from the moment I sold the company that he expected a massive inheritance. He pushed your mother to pressure me constantly. Every holiday, every phone call, it was hints and comments about what he'd do with his share when I died. The pieces were clicking into place. So you pretended to be broke. I didn't have to pretend much. I kept that small house because it was comfortable and I didn't need more. I kept my lifestyle simple because complicated didn't make me happy. When I had the stroke, David showed his true colors. He wanted me in the cheapest nursing home possible, complained about every doctor's appointment, acted like my medical care was a personal burden to him. But I was paying all your medical bills, I said, still reeling. And I reimbursed you for every penny through a trust account you didn't know about. Check your bank statements from the past 2 years. You'll see quarterly deposits that exactly match what you spent on my care. I thought back. There had been some deposits I'd assumed were tax refunds or some clerical errors from my school district's payroll department. Why didn't you tell me? Because you helped me anyway. You took me in without knowing about any of this. You gave up your spare room, rearranged your entire life, and never once asked me for money. You cared about me because I'm your grandfather, not because of what I might leave you someday. Tears were streaming down my face again, but these were different. I love you, Grandpa. Of course, I helped you. I know. That's why everything changes tonight. He pulled an envelope from inside his jacket. How long had he been carrying that? And handed it to me. Inside was a single sheet of paper. A deed. To this house. "Merry Christmas," he said quietly. "This is yours now." "I can't accept this." "Too late. Already done. The paperwork was filed yesterday. This house and everything in it belongs to you as of midnight last night. No taxes, no strings. It's yours." I looked around the room with new eyes. The furniture, the art on the walls, the grand piano in the corner. Mine. This is insane. There's more. I own 109 properties. Apartment buildings, commercial real estate, office parks, shopping centers. They're currently managed by a property management firm, but they generate approximately $17 million annually in net income. I'm signing over 32 of those properties to you. That's roughly $5 million a year in passive income. The numbers had stopped making sense. I was beyond processing. The remaining 77 properties will be divided between various charities upon my passing, along with the bulk of my liquid assets. Your father gets exactly what he deserves, nothing. Kevin gets the same. Your mother will receive a trust that provides her $50,000 a year for the rest of her life, paid up monthly, so she'll never have to rely on your father for anything again if she chooses to finally leave him. Does she know? She will. My lawyer is sending her the trust documents tomorrow. What she does with that information is up to her. We sat in silence for a while. The enormity of everything settling over me like that snow falling outside. My entire life had changed in the space of an hour. From being thrown out of my father's house to sitting in my own mansion. "Why tell me tonight?" I finally asked. "Because you needed to see who they really are without any doubt. And because I wanted you to know that love and loyalty mean something. That choosing kindness has value. Your father threw us out thinking we had nothing and nowhere to go. I wanted you to understand that we have everything we need, and we always did." The next few weeks were a blur. Grandpa's lawyer, Eleanor Vance, helped me understand the full scope of what I now owned. The house came fully staffed, a housekeeping service, a chef who came 3 times a week, a groundskeeper, all paid for through trusts Grandpa had established decades ago. Eleanor, a sharp woman who worked with Grandpa for 30 years, walked me through everything in her downtown office. She had folders and binders stacked on the conference table, each one representing a different aspect of the empire Grandpa had quietly built. "Your grandfather is one of the most prudent investors I've ever worked with," Eleanor explained, sliding a portfolio summary across the mahogany table. "He never chased trends. He bought quality properties in solid markets and held them. The apartment complex in Dallas has appreciated 400% since he purchased it in 2001. The office building in Atlanta generates $600,000 annually in net operating income." I stared at the numbers, struggling to connect them to reality. How did he manage all this without anyone knowing? He used holding companies, trusts, and LLCs. Each property is owned by a separate entity. Unless someone knew where to look and had legal access to those records, they'd never connect John Peterson to East Holdings or Riverside Property Management or any of the other corporate structures. Did my grandmother know? Eleanor's expression softened. Dorothy knew everything. She and John built this together. When she passed 12 years ago, she made him promise to be smart about the inheritance. She didn't trust her father's character, and she wanted to ensure the wealth went to someone who'd use it responsibly. Learning that my grandmother had been part of this plan made it feel more real somehow. She'd been a quiet, thoughtful woman who volunteered at the library and grew prize-winning roses. I'd never imagined her as someone accumulating generational wealth, but maybe that was the point. Real wealth often looked ordinary. The properties were managed professionally and had been for years. I attended a meeting with the property management firm and met the team who'd been handling everything. They were efficient, professional, and frankly relieved to have an owner who might actually engage with the portfolio rather than just collecting checks. The firm's office occupied the top Floor of one of the buildings Grandpa owned, a detail nobody mentioned, but I noticed in the paperwork. The lead property manager, a competent man named Brian Hayes, walked me through each asset. We handled day-to-day operations, maintenance requests, tenant relations, and rent collection, Brian explained, pulling up a digital dashboard that tracked occupancy rates and revenue streams. Your grandfather receives monthly reports, though honestly, he rarely requests changes. He trusts our expertise, which makes our job considerably easier. What happens now that I'm taking over some of these properties? I asked. Nothing changes operationally unless you want it to. We'll send reports to you instead. You'll make decisions on major capital improvements or lease negotiations, but the routine work continues as always. One of the properties particularly interested me, a mixed-use development in Seattle with retail space on the ground floor and apartments above. Brian pulled up the details, showing me photos of the renovated industrial building that now housed a coffee shop, a bookstore, and 12 residential units. This one's special, he said. Your grandfather bought it when the neighborhood was struggling. His investment helped revitalize the entire block. The bookstore owner wrote him a thank you letter last year saying his reasonable rent was the only reason she could keep operating. That sounded exactly like something Grandpa would do. Use his resources to support communities rather than just extract maximum profit. Over the following days, I started visiting the local properties. I walked through apartment buildings where families lived normal lives, completely unaware their landlord was the elderly man in a wheelchair they might occasionally see in the lobby. I toured shopping centers where small business owners had built their dreams, paying rent to anonymous LLC entities that gave them stability in their lease terms. Each property told a story: the strip mall in the suburbs that anchored a working-class neighborhood, the medical office building that housed 3 family practices and a dental clinic, the storage facility that charged below market rates because, as Grandpa put it, people using storage are usually going through transitions and I don't need to profit off their hard times. My favorite discovery was a community center in a lower-income neighborhood that operated rent-free in one of Grandpa's commercial buildings. When I asked Eleanor about it, she smiled. John donated that space 20 years ago, but structured it so the donation came from a foundation, not from him personally. The center provides after-school programs, job training, and senior services. He visits sometimes just to see the programs in action, but nobody there knows he owns the building. I also learned about the investments that hadn't worked out: a retail plaza that struggled after a major anchor tenant left, an office building hit hard by the shift to remote work post-pandemic. Grandpa hadn't won every time, but his overall strategy had been sound enough that the successes far outweighed the failures. The key, Eleanor explained during one of our sessions, is patience. Your grandfather never needed to sell in a down market. He could afford to wait for cycles to turn. That's the real advantage of having capital. You can make decisions based on long-term value rather than short-term necessity. Moving into the Riverside Drive house felt surreal. My apartment had been barely 800 square feet. This house was just over 11,000. I got lost trying to find the laundry room on my 3rd day living there. The staff was welcoming but clearly uncertain about me. They'd worked for Grandpa for years, understood his preferences and routines. Now there was a new owner who was decades younger and taught high school art. I called a meeting with everyone: Maria the head housekeeper, James the groundskeeper, and Chef Pierre who came in 3 times weekly. I know this is a transition, I told them, gathered in the enormous kitchen, but I want you to know that nothing changes with your employment unless you want it to. Grandpa speaks highly of all of you, and I'm grateful for everything you do. Maria, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, visibly relaxed. We were worried you might bring in your own people. Why would I do that? You know this house better than I do. I'm going to need your help just figuring out where everything is. That broke the ice. James laughed and offered to draw me a map. Pierre suggested we sit down together so he could learn my food preferences and any allergies. Maria showed me the household management system, a binder with schedules, maintenance logs, and vendor contacts that was more organized than my entire life had ever been. The room I chose for myself wasn't the master bedroom. That felt too presumptuous, too much like I was taking over Grandpa's space, even though he insisted the house was mine now. Instead, I picked a large bedroom on the second floor with windows overlooking the garden. It had an attached bathroom and a small sitting area, and it felt manageable in a way the master suite didn't. I packed up my old apartment over a weekend, realizing I owned almost nothing worth bringing. My furniture was secondhand and worn. My dishes were mismatched. My art supplies and books were the only things that mattered. Everything fit in my car and Grandpa's van in 2 trips. Travel light, live free, Grandpa commented, watching me unpack my modest collection of belongings into a closet bigger than my old bedroom. I never needed much, I said. Neither did I. That's how I knew the money wouldn't change you. Setting up my art studio took longer. The house had a sunroom on the east side that I converted into my personal creative space. I brought in my easels, my paints, my boxes of supplies I'd accumulated over years of teaching. For the first time in my life, I had room to spread out, to work on multiple projects simultaneously, to really create. My students noticed the change in me, though I never mentioned the money. I seemed lighter somehow, less stressed. I could afford better supplies for classroom projects now, could say yes to field trips without worrying about cost. I started a scholarship fund for students interested in art school, funded anonymously, and watched 3 seniors get acceptance letters to programs they thought were financially impossible. Mom called 5 days after Christmas, crying. She'd received the trust documents. I had no idea, she kept saying. All these years, I had no idea. Does Dad know? I asked. He's paused. He's not handling it well. That was an understatement. According to Kevin, who called me 3 days later, practically screaming, Dad had destroyed half the living room in a rage when he understood exactly what he walked away from. He'd thrown me out thinking I was nobody, a struggling teacher barely making ends meet. Now I own more than he'd ever see in 10 lifetimes. You have to fix this, Kevin demanded. Go talk to Dad. Apologize. Apologize for what exactly? For. I don't know. For not telling him about Grandpa's money. I didn't know about it either until Christmas night. And even if I had, why would Dad deserve to know? So he could be nice to Grandpa just long enough to secure his inheritance? Kevin couldn't answer that. He tried a different approach. Look, we're family. Family forgives. Families shouldn't throw each other out into snowstorms on Christmas. But you're right about forgiveness being important. I forgive Dad for being who he is. I forgive you for being too spineless to stand up to him. That doesn't mean I'm going to pretend none of it happened. He hung up on me. I haven't heard from him since. Dad tried a different strategy. He showed up at my old apartment 2 weeks after Christmas, only to find it empty. I'd moved out within days of inheriting the house. My landlord gave him the forwarding address because apparently, Dad lied and said there was a family emergency. He showed up at the Riverside Drive house on a Tuesday afternoon. I watched from the security cameras as he pressed the intercom button, looking smaller somehow than he had at Christmas. Older, tired. I let him ring for 3 full minutes before finally answering. Can I help you? I asked, my voice crackling through the speaker. Open the gate. We need to talk. No, I don't think we do. Don't be childish. I'm your father. You were my father right up until you threw me and your own father out of your house on Christmas because looking at him made you uncomfortable. I was angry. I made a mistake. No, you showed me exactly who you are. I'm just finally paying attention. Let me in so we can discuss this like adults. There's nothing to discuss. You made your choice. Merry Christmas, Dad. I disconnected the intercom and watched him stand there for another 5 minutes before finally leaving. He tried calling multiple times over the next week. I didn't answer. He showed up at my school, forcing me to have security escort him out. He sent letters that I returned unopened. Mom filed for divorce in February. The trust gave her financial independence, and she finally found the courage to leave after 43 years of marriage. She's living in a nice condo now, dating someone she met at her book club, and she's happier than I've ever seen her. She comes to dinner at the house every Sunday, just her and me and Grandpa, and we've built something good. Grandpa's health improved once he wasn't living under the stress of Dad's constant criticism. We converted one of the first-floor rooms into a bedroom suite for him so he wouldn't have to deal with stairs. He has his own private nurse now, the best physical therapy money can buy, and he's regained some mobility in his affected side. He bought himself a top-of-the-line electric wheelchair that he races around the property, terrorizing the gardener and making the chef laugh. He's teaching me about property management, about investing, about building wealth that matters, not just money, but relationships and purpose and meaning. I kept teaching. People thought I was crazy. Why would I keep working when I had generational wealth now? But I loved teaching. I loved my students. The money just meant I could donate supplies, fund field trips, and make sure no kid in my classes ever went without what they needed. I started a foundation in Grandpa's name that provides support for stroke survivors and their families. We help with medical bills, home modifications, therapy costs, all the things insurance doesn't cover and families can't afford. We've helped over 200 families in the first 8 months alone. Setting up the foundation became my passion project. I hired an executive director named Brenda Miller, who'd spent 20 years in nonprofit management and genuinely cared about the cause. Together, we developed grant programs, established partnerships with hospitals and rehabilitation centers, and created a support network for caregivers. The first family we helped was a single mother named Lisa, whose husband had suffered a massive stroke at 41. Their insurance covered the hospital stay, but nothing else. They needed wheelchair ramps, a modified bathroom, an adjustable bed, and months of occupational therapy. The total cost was approaching $70,000, money they absolutely didn't have. Our foundation covered everything. I insisted on meeting Lisa personally, wanting to understand what families actually needed rather than what I assumed they needed. She broke down crying in my office. I've been working 3 jobs, she told me, exhausted beyond measure, trying to pay for his care and keep the kids fed and not lose our house. I didn't know how we were going to make it. This doesn't seem real. It's real, I assured her. And you're not alone anymore. We funded home modifications for veterans, therapy programs for young stroke survivors, respite care so exhausted family members could rest. We partnered with medical equipment suppliers to get bulk pricing on wheelchairs and walkers. We created educational resources about stroke prevention and recovery. Grandpa attended every board meeting, offering insights from his own recovery journey. He pushed us to think bigger, reach further, help more people. We have the resources, he'd say. Let's actually use them. The foundation also gave me a way to process what had happened with my family. Every family we helped, every caregiver we supported, felt like proof that compassion mattered. That choosing to care for someone wasn't foolish or naive. It was essential. One afternoon, about 8 months after Christmas, I got a call from a rehabilitation center asking if our foundation could help a patient. The family couldn't afford the continued therapy he needed, and they were considering discharging him early. What's the patient's name? I asked the social worker. David Johnson. My hand tightened on the phone. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? David Johnson, 69 years old. He had a stroke 6 weeks ago. The family is, well, frankly, they're overwhelmed and underprepared. My father had had a stroke. I sat in silence for a long moment, feeling a complicated mix of emotions crash over me, vindication, satisfaction, anger, and underneath it all, something that might have been sadness for the man he could have been but never was. What does he need? I asked finally. The social worker outlined the situation. Dad needed 8 more weeks of intensive physical therapy, modifications to his house, ongoing occupational therapy. Kevin and Rachel were struggling to manage. Dad's insurance covered the minimum, and he hadn't saved enough for extended medical care. The irony was staggering. He was living through exactly what he'd condemned Grandpa for. Except he didn't have a daughter willing to take him in. "I need some time to think about this," I told the social worker. "Can I call you back in 2 days?" I found Grandpa in his study reading the newspaper on his tablet. I told him about the call. "What do you want to do?" he asked, his face unreadable. "I don't know. Part of me wants to let him suffer through exactly what he put you through. Let him see what it's like to be the one who needs help." "And the other part?" "The other part knows I didn't build this foundation to exclude people based on personal grudges, even if they deserve it." Grandpa smiled slightly. "That's the difference between you and him right there. You understand that principles matter more than revenge. So, we help him. That's not my decision. It's yours. But whatever you choose, I'll support you." I spent 2 days wrestling with the decision. I'd lie awake at night remembering that Christmas, the cold, the humiliation, the way he'd looked at Grandpa with such contempt. Then I'd think about the families our foundation had helped, about the principles I claimed to stand for. Finally, I called the social worker back. "The foundation will cover his therapy and home modifications. But there's a condition." "What condition?" "He doesn't get to know where the funding came from. It goes through the foundation as an anonymous grant. If he asks, you tell him it's from a charitable donor who wants to remain private." We funded his recovery. All of it. The therapy, the ramps, the bathroom modifications, the follow-up care. Dad got everything he needed to recover. And he never knew it came from the foundation I'd started with money from the father he tried to cast aside. Kevin called me 2 months later, his voice subdued. "I don't know if you heard, but Dad had a stroke." I heard. "He's recovering slowly. Some foundation helped with the costs. We couldn't have managed otherwise." "That's good." There was a long pause. "He's different now. Quieter. He asks about you sometimes." "What do you tell him?" "That I don't know how to reach you." "That's probably for the best." "Is it?" "He's our father. He's sick." "Doesn't that change anything?" "It changes that he understands what Grandpa went through now. What I dealt with taking care of him. Maybe he learned something from it. He wants to apologize. Then he can write me a letter," I said. "But I'm not promising I'll read it." The letter arrived 3 weeks later, forwarded through Kevin. Dad's handwriting was shakier than before, the stroke affecting his fine motor control. I let it sit on my desk for 5 days before finally opening it. The letter was 3 pages of rambling thoughts. He was sorry for Christmas. He was sorry for how he treated Grandpa. He was sorry for being a terrible father. The stroke had given him perspective, and he understood now what really mattered. But nowhere in those 3 pages did he acknowledge the specific cruelty of his actions. He was sorry he'd been angry, but not sorry for throwing us out into a snowstorm. He was sorry he'd been judgmental, but not sorry for calling Grandpa a burden. He was sorry things had gotten out of hand, as though the problem was the escalation rather than his fundamental lack of decency. It was the apology of someone who regretted consequences, not actions. Someone who was sorry he'd lost something valuable, not sorry for causing harm. I put the letter in a drawer and never responded. Dad reached out one more time 6 months after Christmas, a single text message. "Can we talk?" I thought about it for a long time. Talked it through with Grandpa, with Mom, with my therapist. I finally replied, "No, that's the thing about second chances. They're gifts, not obligations." Dad had decades to be a good father, a caring son, a decent human being. He chose cruelty instead. I chose myself. On Christmas Eve, almost a year after everything happened, I hosted dinner at the house. Mom came, bringing her boyfriend Mark, who was kind and funny and treated her like she was precious. Grandpa was there naturally, wheeling around in his fancy chair and making terrible jokes. My closest friends from work came, along with some of the families from my foundation. We ate too much, laughed harder, and celebrated what really mattered, not money or property or status, but connection, love, choosing each other every day. There was a moment late in the evening when I stood in the kitchen looking through the doorway at all these people who mattered to me and felt overwhelmingly grateful. Not for the money, though financial security was nice, but for that terrible Christmas night that showed me the truth about my father, about my own strength, about what kind of person I wanted to be. Dad had thrown me out thinking he was punishing me, teaching me a lesson about respect and obedience. Instead, he'd freed me. Freed me to build a life based on real values, real relationships, real meaning. Grandpa rolled into the kitchen and caught my eye. "You okay?" "Yeah," I said, meaning it. "I really am." "Good, because I need you to settle a bet. Mark says I can't possibly beat him at poker. I need backup." I followed him back to the living room where a card game was starting, and I thought about how funny life was. A year ago, I'd been at my lowest point, crying in a car in a snowstorm, feeling like I'd lost everything. Turns out, I'd been exactly where I needed to be to find it all. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Another text from Dad's number. The preview showed the first line, "Please, can we just..." I deleted it without reading the rest and turned my phone to silent. Some doors, once closed, should stay that way. I had everything I needed right here in this room. Family that chose me back. Purpose that fulfilled me. Wealth that allowed me to help others. And the knowledge that I'd never become the kind of person who measured love in dollar signs or threw people away when they became inconvenient. Dad could live with his choices. I'd live with mine. And I'd never been happier. What's one difficult truth you had to face about someone you loved?